My name is Mahira, and I will be your moderator for this session. To all the attendees, thank you for taking the time off your weekend to be with us on the last day of Socialism 2021 event. Please note that both speakers and I will be speaking a bit more slower than usual, as this session will have our own live interpretations. I believe we have a few interpreters in Malay, Indonesian, and Thai in the background. To kickstart our keynote speech, I would first like to introduce to you our esteemed guests, Mr. Carlos Ron and Vijay Prashad. Hello, and thank you for coming to Socialism 2021. It's an honor for us to have you both spend your time and share your wisdom for us today. So before we begin, I would like to share with you the biography of our guest speaker for the opening greeting speech. Born in Caracas, Venezuela in 1979, is the president of the Simón Bolivar Institute for Peace and Solidarity Among Peoples. As a diplomat, he was Venezuela's charge d'affaires to the United States of America from 2017 to 2018. And he has represented Venezuela before the United States of America in 2014 to 2018, and the Federative Republic of Brazil from 2010 to 2014. He was an advisor at the Office of the Presidential International Relations from 2006 to 2010, coordinator of the research program on regional integration and multilateral agreements at the Miranda International Center in 2006. He graduated in Latin American Studies from Rutgers University, United States, and also has a postgraduate degree in international relations from the University of Brasilia, Brazil. Mr. Carlos Ron is Venezuela's Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs for North America and the President of the Simón Bolivar Institute for Peace and Solidarity Among People. To officiate this session with his greeting speech, please welcome Mr. Carlos Ron.
Thank you very much. Very glad for this opportunity. I bring you your greetings directly from Caracas, Venezuela, where we are right now at it's around 1:15 in the morning, and I know we have a very long time zone distance, but we are very close. We're drawn very close by our commitment to socialism. I want to begin by thanking the Malaysian Socialist Party, the Social Workers Party of Thailand, the Party of Labouring Masses Philippines, the Socialist Alliance of Australia, and the PRP and the KPR parties of Indonesia for this invitation. And I want to greet also everyone else that is joining us at this time with the greeting on behalf of Venezuela, of the Bolivarian Revolution, but also on behalf of all Latin American struggles for emancipation. As president of the Simón Bolivar Institute for Peace and Solidarity Amongst Peoples, we in Venezuela believe that peace and solidarity are precisely two values that we can only truly understand and experience under socialism. In Venezuela, since 2005, when our revolution assumed the banners of socialism, first under the leadership of President Hugo Chavez, and now under the leadership of President Nicolás Maduro, we are building our Bolivarian socialism of the 21st century in defense of our sovereignty, in defense of our independence, in defense of our identity and our own history. In sum, in defense of humanity itself. This has not been an easy task at all. Pressures, as you all know, as you all have also experienced, are and can be enormous. On one hand, there is a difficulty of implementing socialism on one of the most capitalist-oriented systems in Latin America, one built on oil economy, which was what Venezuela has had to deal with. Therefore, for us, the transition towards socialism has meant that we needed to make socialism something practical, something beyond theory, something that we can carry out in practical terms and that truly disputes the current capitalist model. Our communes, the project of the communes, are where we see those concrete examples of socialism being carried out. Not one commune is the same as the other, but it's the building of these territorial spaces with true community organization and direct democratic participation what makes up their essence and what makes ours a truly socialist project. It's a project, again, in dispute. It's a project in the making. And for this, we face challenges. We face constant intervention and violence. The collapse of the supremacy of the United States now makes it even more difficult for us to carry out this process. We're faced with a terrible hybrid war with criminal and illegal sanctions from imperialism, which seeks to overturn the social gains that we have achieved under our socialist-oriented model, and which seeks to coerce our population into regime change. That's why we stand up every day against this aggression with the resilience and commitment that is true of socialist forces. We believe that in a time of crisis, such as the one we're facing now, it is popular forces around the world that we need to struggle together and protect our rights and to put our efforts together to save our planet and to save our humanity. That is why I am happy to be participating at this conference. I am honored to have the opportunity to share the space on Latin America with my dear comrade and brother, Vijay Prashad, who is an expert as well on our region and has experienced our process and has been in international solidarity with our process and knows about our struggles and can help share our struggles with faraway comrades such as yourself. I'm happy again to have been invited for this discussion. And I want to end by saying that Venezuela is committed to continue, despite all these challenges and despite all the attacks of imperialism, we're committed to continue building our socialism. We know that no two systems are alike. We know that no two formulas can be alike. We need to adapt our struggles to our own realities and to our own histories, to our own identities. But we have an internationalist commitment to support the struggles of peoples throughout the world that have the same commitment and the same struggles to defend humanity, to defend and preserve our planet, and to build a society that is truly constructed on solidarity with a lasting peace based on social justice. Comrades, I thank you for this opportunity to address you. I thank you for this opportunity for you to get to know about our struggles in Latin America, our struggles in Venezuela in particular, our struggles in Cuba, our struggles in Nicaragua, in Bolivia, and all the progressive forces throughout our continent that struggle each day to make socialism a reality and to make this world a truly more just world. Thank you very much for this opportunity from Venezuela, and long live socialism, and you can count with us, comrades.
Thank you for that insightful and uplifting opening speech, Mr. Carlos, always in solidarity with Venezuela. Latin America, which one? Cuban, Bolivian, Venezuelan, Argentinian? There are a lot of countries to cover. And I bet when you think of Latin America, some of you would think of their football more than their history. As majority of the viewers today are perhaps mostly Southeast Asians, you probably think that the politics in Latin America itself is a heavy subject to discuss and somewhat intimidating and too complex to unpack. And yet, we as leftists would oftentimes quote Fidel Castro or Hugo Chavez, admire the charismatic stencil gravity of Che Guevara everywhere in our street art or in our social media. We also hear about the political turmoil of any Latin American countries, and we hear about the embargoes and the sanction, and yet We as Southeast Asian cannot relate to it or understand the gravity of the situation happening there. We, just like other parts of the world, were mostly fed with the Western media fear-mongering propaganda in the news, online, or on paper. We regard the South American suffering and their bad economy for decades being mostly their problem. We unfortunately only know Latin America either on a very surface level or from a highly distorted and biased narrative. We would know about the challenges, such as the 33,000 Argentinians massacred, or how even the imperialist effort in not just the killing of the people, but also killing in the mission of killing the dream. We also have the impression that the transition from capitalism to socialism would initially take place in the advanced capitalist societies and not in the underdeveloped countries in Asia, Africa, or Latin America. This is why it's time for us to sit down and listen and be schooled by the expert in this critical topic. Mr. Vijay Prashad is an Indian historian, journalist, editor, commentator, and Marxist intellectual. He is the director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and the chief editor of LeftWord Books. He is the author of over 20 books, including The Darker Nations, a biography of short-lived Third World and the Poorer Nations, a possible history of the Global South. His most recent book is The Red Star Over the Third World, and he writes regularly for The Frontline, The Hindu, Alternate, and Birgun. Without further ado, please welcome Mr. Vijay Prashad.
So, listen, Mahira, thanks a lot for that introduction. It's really great to follow my comrade, my great brother and friend, Carlos Ron, with whom I shall be in Venezuela in, just a few days. We shall be together celebrating the resilience of the Venezuelan people, looking across the Caribbean Sea at the Cubans, who twice this year defeated opportunity by the United States government to overthrow the Cuban Revolution. It shall never be defeated. Its vanquishers will themselves fall. And I suppose we'll also look, Carlos, across the other direction towards Honduras and Nicaragua, two of the most significant election victories in Central America against the wishes of Washington, D.C. So, Joe Biden, next week you're going to hold a democracy summit, I hear. I gather you've brought 150 countries to be with you. Democracy, you say? What kind of democracy, Joe? I mean, let's think about this. You have a country where people are not going to vote. You have a country where people don't really have faith in the democratic institutions any longer. You have a country with extreme rates of inequality and no program to help the people. I'm not talking about Venezuela. I'm not talking about Cuba. I'm not talking about Nicaragua or North Korea. I'm talking about the United States. There is a serious crisis, Joe. It's a crisis of democracy, but it's not your democracy threatened by anybody else. There's a crisis of your own democratic institutions. You know, when you fly into an airport in the United States, you'll be stunned to see how poor the infrastructure is. And that's because, listen, Joe, you haven't been able to tax your own rich, raise the funds needed to fix your own infrastructure. You know, you came before the people in the United States and said, I'm going to have an infrastructure bill. Remember that? Remember that, Joe, when you said, I'm going to raise money and we're going to have this big infrastructure bill? You can't even put forward an infrastructure bill. What you got elected to do, that's a crisis of democracy. You're not being threatened by the Chinese. The Chinese don't really care about what's happening in the United States. The last that I've seen, there are no Chinese submarines or Chinese warships off the coast of California or off the coast of New York. There are US warships off the coast of China. I don't think there's a threat to democracy in the United States coming from outside. There is an internal crisis of democracy, Joe, and you need to take care of that. You need to take care of your own house before you cast aspersions around the world at your great democracy summit. It's such a democratic summit, my friends, that the United States decided to not allow Turkey, Russia, and China to attend it. It's a democratic summit, but the rules of admission are not democratic. They decided who's allowed in and who's not allowed in. That's hardly a democratic issue. And by the way, let me tell you something. A summit for democracy, there is already a summit for democracy. It's called the UN General Assembly. It's the United Nations General Assembly. It takes place every year in September. Of course, the United States doesn't accept the United Nations as an actual democratic body, but that's a problem of the United States. You see, in June, Joe Biden made a comment referring to Russia, where he said, we are no longer willing to um, have our elections interfered with, no longer willing to have our elections because after all, he said, no country would tolerate its elections interfered with. And then he said, we would never interfere with other people's elections. And you know what's interesting, comrades, is that the journalists from CNN and Bloomberg and all these god awful media outlets, they grabbed their notebooks and they went running and said, Joe Biden has said that the United States will never interfere in any other country. Never. And how terrible it would be, Joe Biden said, if we interfered in other countries' elections. Imagine that. It's not that the media is gullible. It's just that they think that the United States has its own rules. Now, look, we know, we have evidence. It's not our evidence, it's the CIA releases. You can go to the CIA digital library. There's a massive study of the CIA saying, yes, we interfered in Iran. We overthrew the government in 1953. We interfered in Guatemala, overthrew the government of Jacob Arbenz 1954. Yes, we've interfered in Cuba since 1959, tried to assassinate Fidel Castro 653 times. 653 times. Yes, the United States paid money to the Christian Democratic Party in Italy in the elections of 1947, I believe. The United States paid money to the right wing to win that election. In Chile, in 1964, the United States paid money. The CIA brought suitcases of cash to the right wing so that Allende would not win in 64. I'm not talking about 1970 or 71. I'm talking about the 60s. The United States conducted a coup against the Brazilian government, a democratic government in Brazil in 1964, and then turned towards Asia and conducted a brutal coup, green lighted a coup, not only United States, Australia. People forget the dirty role Australia played in the coup in Indonesia. 1 million plus communists killed in the matter of weeks. Let's never forget them, okay, comrades? Over 1 million of our people killed. They talk about the crimes of communism. What about a list of the crimes of imperialism? So here's Joe assembling this conference of summit on democracy, okay? That's there. And then he's saying in June, we never interfere in other countries. And are we gullible enough to just accept this? Are we not campaigning to demonstrate? Are we not campaigning every day to demonstrate that this is just lies? Are you allowing the press in Malaysia, in Thailand, in Indonesia, and Australia? Are you allowing your press to run this drivel as news and not challenge it? I hope you have demonstrations every day in front of your media outlets that pass off this propaganda as rational news reporting. I hope so, comrades, because that's exactly what Latin America and other parts of the world, Iran and so on, need. They need you to make sure that you're telling the truth about what's happening in the world. Right now, on the precipice exists Latin America. Let's not be misled by the victories that have taken place. And I am going to give you a list of the victories. Let's not be misled. Yes, the government in Bolivia is back, the movement for socialism. There was a coup in 2019. The government of Luis Arce and David Choquehuanca won an election. They dismissed the coup at the ballot box. Yes, it's true. Xiomara Castro Zelaya and her party Libre in Honduras are back in power, a center-left government. They fought against the coup of 2009, 10 years before Bolivia. Yes, it's true. In Honduras, in Bolivia, governments that are left of center are in power. That's true. It's also true that the government in Nicaragua, led by Daniel Ortega, has won an election by an enormous margin. It's true. It's true that in Venezuela, the ruling Socialist Party was able to win 19, or maybe by the end of a couple of weeks, 20 governorships. Yes, it's true, a majority. Let's not be misled by these things. It's also true that likely by next year, you might have a center left president in Chile. It's unlikely but possible that Boric will defeat this hideous fascist Mr. Cast. It's likely that he will win on this week, actually, coming in December. It's also likely that next year Lula will win against the right wing in Brazil and come back to power. That's also likely. But don't get too excited by all this, because there are two pressures that I want to talk to you a little bit about. I want to spend some time on. One is the role of US imperialism. It's a role that is often minimized these days. People are embarrassed to use the term imperialism. They don't want to talk about imperialism. They want to talk about everything. Democracy, they want to talk about China, they want to talk about everything. But they don't want to talk about the hideousness of imperialism, what imperialism has done to our world. That's one thing I want to talk about with you. The second is that the serious internal problems that South America and Latin America in general faces. One is, as Carlos was saying, you build socialism not on an empty slate, but you build it on history. And South America, Latin America in general, has a hideous history of oligarchies, closely related to the military. You got to remember that. And you have to remember the growth of evangelical Christianity. I'm going to talk to you about that in a little bit, because we need to be prepared. You see, this is not a place where we just come and meet and say, yes, look at all these victories. We have to prepare for the fight. That's what we're preparing for when you have a conference like Socialism. We prepare for the fight. We don't come only to celebrate our gains. We come to prepare for the fight. And so that's what I want to talk to you about. Okay? So that's what I'm going to spend. Mahira, nobody's told me how long I can talk for. So, I can go for till your morning if you want. You have to tell me at some point that that's about it. Stop now. Okay? Don't tell me now. I'm just getting going. We just bemoaned sorrowfully the problems of old Joe. Now we're coming to imperialism. Look, imperialism is a real thing. It exists in the world. You talk to the Cubans, you talk to the Venezuelans, they can tell you that imperialism is real. We often call what's happening to Venezuela in particular the hybrid war. Carlos and I and Manolo de los Santos and Claudia de la Cruz did a book called Viviremos. The subtitle of that book is Venezuela versus Hybrid War. This concept, hybrid war, is very important. Before I get to imperialism, I want to share with you what are some of the aspects of the hybrid war. The first aspect of the hybrid war is political. You see, what the United States does is, it uses its considerable media apparatus and its ideological advantages, because United States has produced this view of itself as a free country, this view that it is, in a sense, the bastion of democracy. So they're able to paint their adversaries as authoritarian. So the first thing in a hybrid war is political. They say, for instance, that listen, you can't any longer be in good faith a country in a regional body. For instance, in the Arab states, no longer can Syria be part of the Arab League. You will be ejected from the regional body. Then they want to take away your seat at the United Nations. They just declare that you are person non grata as a government. Nobody is supposed to deal with you. They make you into a pariah. Very clever operation. They get all their allies, they're basically their toadies, to line up behind them. And they say, no, don't deal with them. And that's a political form of isolation. That's often where it begins. Then there's economic isolation. There's the economic war. Now, this is a very serious kind of war. You see, you got to understand that the United States and the dollar since the 1970s has played a fundamental role as the global currency. It's very difficult to take our own currencies. If you're in Thailand, you have the baht, you say, well, we have a sovereign currency. You don't have a sovereign currency. The baht is denominated against the dollar. When you trade, when Thailand trades with India, for instance, it doesn't trade in rupees or in baht, it trades in dollars. Dollar is the mediating currency. It's very hard to break out of that. It's very hard to say, okay, we'll use the Russian ruble or the euro. No, you'll still have to be denominating in dollars. You often have to borrow from capital markets in dollars. Those are dollar denominated debts. The hegemony of the dollar makes a country very vulnerable to economic warfare. They cut you off. They don't allow you to access dollars. They can starve your economy. And most of our countries with a history of colonialism, we don't have the kind of assets and resources where we can afford to say we don't care about your capital markets. We have to access them. We can't otherwise import energy, oil, or whatever. We can't import technology. We can't trade, in fact. Okay? Then the entire system of money transfer, the so-called SWIFT system that all of us rely on, that's headquartered in Brussels. And so if there are sanctions placed by the United States, it's hard to access the SWIFT system. Iran was totally cut off from the SWIFT system. That makes it hard for Iranians living outside Iran to send money into Iran, remittance payments. So many of our countries rely on remittance payments. This is a huge punishment. Then, even worse, you see, many of our central banks don't keep their dollars inside their own countries. You see, you don't keep your dollars in Kuala Lumpur. You'll keep your dollars in London or in New York or in Frankfurt or somewhere else, maybe even in Tokyo, but not necessarily in Kuala Lumpur. You'll keep it outside. And if they want to punish you, they seize your dollar assets. Venezuela, for instance, had money in the Bank of London. Till today, the Bank of London will not allow Venezuela to access its assets. Afghanistan's $9 billion are sitting in New York. The US government is not allowing the government in Afghanistan to access it. By the way, 9 out of 10 people in Afghanistan live in poverty. 50% of the Afghan people are near starvation. As the winter sets in, there are going to be starvation deaths in Afghanistan. Yet the United States doesn't release that money. There's a cruelty in the heart of imperialism, okay? There's cruelty. Let's not minimize that. So there's economic warfare. It's very hard to walk away and say, we'll just do it on our own. We'll declare sovereignty. You can't. It's not that easy. Venezuela can't just say, forget it. We don't want to deal with international trade. We'll turn within. You can't. As Carlos was saying, you've relied on exporting oil for decades. You've relied on importing food. Venezuelan people are now struggling to produce food, and they're going to do it. They'll triumph. But you still have to import things. You can't rely on everything from inside. That means you need to have currency. That means you need to access capital markets. You're back in the whole thing. They suffocate you through sanctions. And if they have secondary sanctions, then other companies who are not even American companies don't want to do business there. You see, Jack Ma, the Chinese billionaire, hired a plane to fly to Cuba with masks at the beginning of the pandemic. Okay? Masks and sanitizer and so on. The plane refused to fly to Cuba. Do you know why? It was a plane owned and licensed in Colombia. But one of the owners of the plane was a US citizen. And he said, I'm not going to allow my plane to fly to Cuba because I'm worried about the sanctions. Even though it was a humanitarian mission. And to some extent, you could make the argument humanitarian missions don't have to comply with the sanctions. But yet, he was scared. And that's what the sanctions does. So economic suffocation is part of the hybrid war. It's total. There are over 30 countries in the world that are suffering now from economic sanctions, illegal unilateral economic sanctions by the United States. Okay? So that's there. Now, the third form of hybrid war is cultural. And this is very significant. It's the information war. They first say that, these people are authoritarian. They lie about you. They'll say that, oh, in Cuba, they are arresting people. There's no evidence of that. When the July 11th protest took place in Cuba, a small town south of Havana, the president of Cuba, Miguel Diaz-Canel, got into a car and he drove to that town and he walked among the protesters and said, what's going on here? Have you ever seen pictures of an American president, a president of the United States, go to the Black Lives Matter protests or any of those? They never go. They never go. They never talk to protesters like that. So we don't see images of Miguel Diaz-Canel walking among the people chatting with them. They'll say, no, he's a dictator. See, he's a dictator. And that's because they have a cultural power in the world. They control and command media houses. And also there's a racist thing that operates, the white man is always going to be trusted, whereas some Arab leader, he's a thug, right? End of the day, some Arab, African, South American, Asian leader, they are thugs. It's George W. Bush responsible for the illegal murder of 1 million Iraqis. Nobody is going to say George W. Bush is a war criminal. But Bashar al-Assad is a war criminal. How many people has he killed? Not even a fraction of what George W. Bush killed in Iraq. Do you understand what I'm saying? This is the cultural part of the hybrid war. It has a grip on our imagination. We can't even think around it. So the hybrid war is a manifestation of imperialism. Now, I want to tell you why is imperialism exist. It's not like some habit, that has no value in the world. There are two concrete reasons why imperialism exists. One is, right now, the imperial core is in the United States of America. It operates on behalf of multinational corporations. It operates on behalf of the advanced capitalist countries. Some of them are in Europe, North America, including Canada. And then there's, of course, Japan, and to some extent here and there, it might be South Korea, maybe India once in a while, okay? But these are all basically, desperately running after old Joe. Joe is at the heart of the imperialist complex right now, for now. Well, anybody who seriously challenges the so-called rules-based order set by the United States cannot be tolerated. You see, Cuba is a country of 11 million people. For God's sake, Cuba doesn't have oil. Just let the Cubans do their thing. What's your problem? It's only 11 million people, smaller than the population of New York City. Let the Cubans do their thing. What's your problem? Seriously. Let them fiddle around with socialism and, whatever they're doing. Why are you so bothered? They're bothered because Cuba is producing a model for the rest of us. You see, even though Cuba has been in dire straits since the collapse of the Soviet Union, lost an enormous amount of its external revenue, they have not cut their health spending. They have not cut their education spending. Meanwhile, look at our countries, India, Malaysia, Thailand. Look at our countries. What do we do? First time there's IMF shows up, what do? We cut our health spending. We cut our education spending. We prefer to starve our own populations than stand up to the IMF. So Cuba has to be crushed because it has sovereignty and dignity. This is the same problem with Iran and China. They don't accept that what the United States must go. They'll say, we don't agree with you. We don't agree with you. And for that, they have to be crushed. So the first reason imperialism operates in this brutal way using the tools of hybrid war is because they will not tolerate a challenge, a systemic challenge to them, where different sets of morals and so on rise to the surface. What did Cuba export? Not bombs, comrade, but doctors. You see, that's not acceptable. You can only export bombs. You can only export bombs. You can bomb a country, but you can't let doctors fly in and heal people. What has Cuba done? It has sent the Henry Reeve Brigade, over 2,000 doctors all around the world. What did the US government say? Oh, they are slaves. That's what the US government said. They are not being paid properly. They are slaves. There's not one US doctor traveling the world under the auspices of the US government. And by the way, they are slaves. Which countries had slavery? Which countries operated slavery? Certainly not the Cuban Revolution. Certainly not the Cuban Revolution. Okay? First thing is, you can't put your head above water and say we are people of dignity. Second thing is about actual resources. You see, there are two ways of reason. I'm going to go through a list of what we call at our institute the 5 controls. Okay? I'm going to go into that in a minute. But resources don't just mean, lithium and indium and coal and, well, not coal. They don't like coal anymore. Lithium, indium, oil, that kind of thing, natural gas. Not just that. But also, our countries have to keep wages below the levels of normality. There's wage deflation, income deflation in the third world. That's part of the resource of capitalism. International global capital relies on income deflation in places like India. You see, they'll say that Indian laborers don't need to get paid much because their quality of life is different. They don't think of life like a European. When an Indian dies, they don't even know. They died or what? They're sleeping. They don't even. This is the racist attitude towards our lives, that we don't need to strive to have the kind of lifestyle of the European. This is what this cultural kind of racist idea is what creates the basis for income deflation, a necessary part of international capital. Okay, that's how the global supply chain functions. Look at the factories in Cambodia, in Malaysia, in Bangladesh, the garment factories. They basically make a profit for multinational companies through income deflation. By the way, in Cambodia, the factories closed during the pandemic. You know what these companies did? $109 million of severance was stolen by these multinational companies from Cambodian workers. 109 million US dollars stolen from the workers who live hand to mouth, by the way. Okay, so you get the point. Imperialism it's not just like a bad attitude. There are some material bases of imperialism. One is the idea that you can't have sovereignty, and the other is that there is something to be gained from it. Well, I want to quickly go over the 5 controls just so that you're quite clear about what I'm saying. You see, Mahira is wondering, when is he going to get to Latin America? But the issue is, what's the point of me just telling you stories if I'm not sharing with you the theory? We got to understand why they're doing this. Because then you can read the press and you can fill in the details. Let's get the theory clear first, okay? So we got the hybrid war. Then I said, why would they do a hybrid war? Well, there's two reasons. One is you're not allowed to display that you're doing a different model of development, what Cuba is doing or what Venezuela. You have to be squashed for your model of development or what Bolivia is doing and so on. Secondly, for your resources, that means the lithium in Bolivia. And also, don't you dare lift your wages above starvation levels. That's unacceptable. Okay. Haiti was trying to do it. Hillary Clinton directly intervened in the Haitian parliament to stop the Haitians from lifting the minimum wage in wretchedly poor Haiti. Imagine that, on behalf of multinational corporations, Hillary Clinton, as Obama's Secretary of State, directly intervened. Talk about don't interfere in other countries, okay? Directly intervened to stop a minimum wage bill in Haiti. I write about this in my book, Washington Bullets, if you're interested in. And we should get the book to Malaysia and other places. It's got an interesting history in it, guys. It's pretty shocking history, frankly. Okay, 5 controls. What are they? There are 5 areas of human life that imperialism controls and does not want to loosen its control over. The first is control over science and technology. And the way it does this is through the intellectual property regime. This intellectual property regime is really significant. During the pandemic, that is the reason why they will not give a WTO waiver on vaccine patents, because the patent is property. So control over science and tech. The real reason the United States is going crazy about China isn't some Chinese, like whatever, Chinese diplomat is insulted somebody or whatever. The real issue is China has made advances in science and technology, particularly in 5G telecommunications. It's made advances in robotics, in high-speed rail, and so on. You saw the train connecting China to Laos. This is unforgivable because China is jumping 1 or 2 generations above US firms in these areas. So control over science and technology, number 1, very important for imperialism. Number 2, control over financial systems. You can't do an economic war unless you control and dominate financial systems. No challenge to the dollar allowed. No alternative to the SWIFT system allowed. No alternative to the hegemony of Western banks allowed. Yes, you can create your own banking system, but they will have to work through Frankfurt, London, Tokyo, or New York. That's without doubt. Okay. So control over the financial system. Third, control over access to resources. You want to own your own mine? Go ahead. We don't need to own your mine, but we will control access to it. The United States didn't say that the mines in Bolivia should be owned by US companies. In fact, even in the 1970s in Chile, the United States companies didn't say we want to own the copper mines. They said we want to control access to the resources. Chileans can own it, but we are the ones who are the only buyer of the copper, and we set the price. That's how you control access to resources. They won't allow so-called resource socialism, where a country, say Bolivia, says we'll set the price for our lithium and we will tell you how to pay us, and we want the following things for what we are giving you at a good price anyway, but you can't set the price and take it because that's just going to beggar us. So the third thing is control over access to resources. Fourth thing, control over weaponry. You can't build your own weapon systems. If you want to buy weapons, you buy it from the United States, you buy it from Sweden. I mean, Sweden. How dare Sweden give a Nobel Peace Prize? Okay, it's one of the world's per capita major arms sellers. They have a company called Bofors, which sells howitzers. I mean, for God's sake, what is this peace prize that you give? Sweden should first give a peace prize to its own government. If its own government bans arms sales around the world, that would be a good thing. Then I would say, hey, full respect to you, Sweden. Otherwise, you're a bunch of hypocrites. You're giving a peace prize. Firstly, they gave it to Obama. They gave it before to Henry Kissinger, of all people to give it to. So what I'm trying to get at is it's control over weaponry. They will give the weapons, they will sell the weapons. And let me tell you something, 40% of the world's weapons that are sold by US arms contractors. 40%, mind you. The rest are largely from Europe and minor amounts from Israel and other basically, basically satellites of the United States are the others who sell arms. Okay. So the fourth thing is control over weaponry. And the fifth is control over communications. Control over, this is very important, this control over communications. You see, they'll allow you to have your own media and so on. You can have your own domestic media. But let me tell you, in the foreign pages of your media, the page that carries news about Latin America and so on, the stories will come from Reuters, the stories will come from Associated Press, the stories will come from Agence France Presse, they may be downloaded from CNN, they may come from BBC, and that's it. Okay, that's it. You're not going to get the news in your newspapers from Granma, the great newspaper of the Cuban Revolution. Not a chance. You're not even going to get your news from La Jornada, which is Mexico's left of center newspaper. Not a chance. Not a chance. You'll get your news at best from that wretched British newspaper called The Guardian, which is essentially a hybrid war newspaper. You look at The Guardian, not only did they railroad Jeremy Corbyn, but give me one story that they have published, which is essentially understanding of the Cuban Revolution or the Bolivarian Revolution or whatever. Okay. So the fifth thing is control over communication. It's very important to understand that. Don't buy all the stuff that they tell you. Look at the reporting that's coming out of about China. Okay, let me give you an example. Hong Kong. Okay, Hong Kong. You know who's the most upset about lack of democracy in Hong Kong and is always on BBC? Chris Patton. Do you know who this British gentleman is, Chris Patton, who's always on BBC? He's a white guy, always talking about how he's heartsick about lack of democracy in Hong Kong. Do you know who he is? He was the last Governor General in Hong Kong. When the British ruled Hong Kong, during the entire period that they held it as a consequence of stealing it during the Opium War, the last British authoritarian Governor General, Mr. Chris Patton, they never gave any democracy in Hong Kong while the British ruled it, okay? It was totally held with an iron fist. Okay, our brother Ho Chi Minh was in jail in Hong Kong in the 1920s. We well know what Hong Kong's democracy was like to Mr. Ho Chi Minh, our great comrade leader, okay? So, Chris Patton is on BBC talking about, oh my God, I'm crying, Hong Kong, no democracy. You did nothing when you were the Governor General, okay? You did nothing. Now you're crying. Why? Because Hong Kong has returned to where it came from, which is China. What is your problem? In India, for instance, in 1961, Indian government didn't wait for the Portuguese lease of Goa to go. Indian army entered Goa in 1961 and brought it back into India. We ejected the Portuguese by armed force. Imagine if the Chinese did that today. There'd be like hue and cry in the press. 1948, the Indian army entered Hyderabad and ejected the Nawab and just took Hyderabad into India. They said it's our territory, the Indian national territory. Nobody said anything to India in 1948. Okay, just bear with me for a second. This is how communication warfare takes place. Look at how they talk about Cuba. It's so interesting. They said, oh, there is a protest movement and the Cuban government is harassing dissidents. What dissidents? November 15th, there was meant to be an uprising. There was one artist guy, Mr. Junior, Mr. Junior was to lead an uprising. Archipelago, he had set up a Facebook group. My feeling is it was largely populated by people in Miami. By the way, I hope you know that Miami is a city in Florida in the United States. Miami is not a town in Cuba. A lot of Cubans live there, but they are right-wing Cubans. A lot of the Archipelago group on the Facebook page of this group are sitting in Miami, not in Cuba. When that 15th November so-called uprising was zero, Mr. Junio that evening got on a plane, he was allowed to leave the country. Okay, he called for an uprising against the Cuban Revolution. Nobody stopped him. He was at home the whole day, by the way. Press came and asked him what's happening. He's got a headache sitting at home. There was no protest. He takes a taxi, goes to the airport. He flies to Spain. Next day, he's in Spain, okay? He's all free. What in jail? He's sitting in Spain. Who does he go and visit in Spain? Who is he visiting in Spain the next day? Takes a photograph, posted on Twitter. It's Mr. Leopoldo Lopez. Who is Mr. Leopoldo Lopez? Mr. Leopoldo Lopez is the guy who hates the Bolivarian Revolution, Venezuelan, now lives in so-called exile in Spain. These are all, by the way, self-inflicted exiles. He's sitting in Spain, okay, Mr. Leopoldo Lopez. He tried to overthrow the Bolivarian government by force. And he's sitting in Spain. He meets Mr. Unio. They take a photograph, so happy. Two fellows who tried to overthrow a government by force. And you see, the United States government will say, these are the Democrats. This is the Democrats. Joe Biden will probably invite them to come by video link to his great democracy summit. These two fellows tried to overthrow a government by force. And they are suddenly the great Democrats. Okay, I want you to register what I'm saying for a minute. Okay, this is the information war. And people around the world believe it. They'll believe Juan Guaido. By the way, you must go and see on somewhere online. He's giving a speech and his emblem collapses. His pseudo emblem of head of state of Venezuela falls on the ground while he's speaking. I mean, he's a Potemkin character. He's a Potemkin character. Do you know the phrase Potemkin village? During the Tsar's time in Russia, when the Tsar left his palace and traveled around Russia, there was a man called General Potemkin. And what General Potemkin would do is he would create fake happy villages. So when the Tsar's carriage went through, he would see these fake houses with fake well-fed villagers waving to him like Disneyland, Not real, guys. It's a Potemkin village. Juan Guaido, he's a Potemkin president. He's a president of a fake country. The country that he's a president of doesn't exist. Or if it exists in his head. You see, he's Washington's favorite Venezuelan. But it's only in his head. But yet, you see how clever the control over communications is. They will reach their tentacles into Kuala Lumpur, into Bangkok, far away, and they'll tell you Juan Guaido is the president of Venezuela and Nicolas Maduro is, not the president, and so on. And you won't know any better because the communication war is fierce. Fierce. Associated Press will give a story, it will be published. And then, crackpot people like myself will say, this is nonsense. It's insane. And, then their communication war will dismiss us. They're paranoid, nutty people, conspiracy theorists, and so on. I admit there's a lot of conspiracy theorists and nutcases on social media. Okay, I grant you they are there. But let me tell you, and I know it sounds crazy to say it, but I want to put my hand up and swear I'm not a nutcase. I also want to put my hand up and swear and say I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm telling you the facts. These are, verifiable things that I'm telling you. Okay, these are verifiable things. There's been an election. A person has a constitution that they are adhering to. Somebody shows up and says, I'm the president. I can come on your platform today and say, I'm the president of Malaysia. How does that sound? Today I declare myself the legitimate president. It's an insane thing. We don't have the media to come and barrel away and the American president to say, I acknowledge and accept you. You see, that's the communication war. I want you to really taste what I'm talking about because this stuff is real. Okay. Now, I said that it's not easy to build a socialist project. It's not even easy after you win an election. In Peru, there was a hard-fought election, very hard-fought election. President Pedro Castillo, a leader of the teachers' union, wins the presidency. And admittedly, it was a fragile win because it was a close election. I accept that. The data, available data shows it was a close election, but he won the election. His opponent acknowledged that he won the election and that she lost. Now, I should tell you that during the just before the election, in fact, between the two rounds in the presidential elections in Latin America, it's the old style. They have a first round and a second round. In other words, they still believe in democracy, where they have lots of candidates in the first round, whittle it down to two. And the French do that as well. Anyway, between the two rounds, the United States sent a new ambassador to Lima. She's an ex-CIA agent, very smart person, very good person. Young woman, CIA, comes in as the ambassador in Lima. And she's basically in touch with a bunch of right-wing scoundrels, including the close advisor to this woman running from the right, Madame Fujimori. Okay. Her advisor is in and out of the embassy almost daily. What are they doing? Don't tell me it's just a courtesy call. And if this CIA ambassador wants to meet the various presidential candidates and their teams, why isn't she meeting everybody? Why only the right wing? In and out every day. Pedro Castillo wins. In other words, the left, center left, it's a coalition, comes into the presidential house in Lima, which is really on the edge of town, inside, almost on the Pacific Ocean. He is there. And then they isolate him. And I can tell you from experience, friends, there's money exchanged here. There's a lot of corruption that takes place at this crucial stage when a left comes in. People start to turn their backs on the government and they cut him off from his own party, Peru Libre, and they cut him off from the leader of the party. And then when he brings on board one of the most respected academics in South America, a respected academic as his foreign minister, Hector Behar, they force Hector to resign within a week. Within a week. They cut him off from the left, completely isolate him. And whatever the thinking that Pedro Castillo has is not the question here. What I'm trying to tell you is, if they can't steal an election from you, when you win, they make it difficult to govern. Either they isolate you from your base, or they do what they're doing to Venezuela, which is they try to suffocate the country. And they've been trying to suffocate Venezuela, not since President Nicolas Maduro took over, but since Hugo Chavez won his election in 1998 and came into office in 99. The suffocation starts right then. You may remember they tried to do a coup against Chavez in 2002. That was even before Hugo Chavez declared that Venezuela was going to pursue a full socialist path. Before that, they tried to coup him. Do you know why they tried to coup him in 2002? Because he was going to pursue a resource sovereignty agenda. That is, Venezuela was going to dictate the terms of oil sales and oil contracts. That was not acceptable. The chairperson of Barrick Gold, one of Canada's largest mining corporations, wrote an article, public article in the press, in a mainstream Canadian newspaper, essentially calling for the overthrow of Hugo Chavez, a democratically elected president of a country. Okay, publicly, the head of a mining company called for so. And at the University of Toronto, the School of International Affairs is named after that man, Mr. Monk. It's the Monk School of International. You can bet what kind of academic scholarship is produced there. Highly funded by Barrick Gold, one of the world's nastiest mining companies. And I want you to look up Barrick Gold because of what they've been doing in Papua New Guinea. The Porgia mine in Papua New Guinea. I want you to look at that. I wrote a couple of stories about it. It's a horribly disturbing place to visit. What Barrick Gold has been doing in Southeast Asia and so on. I want you to take a look at it because what the story I'm telling you is not far from your own experience. Okay, I'm going to wrap up now. So don't worry about it.
Okay, Mr. Vijay, we actually have 15 more minutes for
Yeah,
you
yeah.
to
15 minutes
speak.
is the wrap up. Don't worry.
Okay. So,
All
yes, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I'll wrap up in a minute. Then we
Okay.
can have more time for questions. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So the basic story is that in Latin America, there is a project that, in fact, the Cuban Revolution inaugurated, which was sovereignty for Latin America from what the US had proposed in 1823, which was the Monroe Doctrine. The Cuban Revolution in 1959 and 1960 declared a challenge to the Monroe Doctrine. From 1959 till 1999, largely Cuba was alone, largely, except for small times when it found alliances, like in the government of Salvador Allende in Chile between 1970 and 1973, when it was overthrown in a coup. When Hugo Chavez won the election in 1998, in a new period without the Soviet Union there, the Bolivarian Revolution provided the second major challenge to the Monroe Doctrine. But it was able, because Cuba and Venezuela were there together, in 2004, Cuba and Venezuela joined together and opened a Bolivarian process for the whole of the hemisphere. They signed an agreement which became known as the Bolivarian Treaty, the ALBA, the Bolivarian area of the Americas. ALBA, later it was the People's Treaty Organization. This is the challenge to fundamental imperialism of the United States. And that is why they've been trying to suffocate these governments. They cannot allow it because, one, remember, they're standing up exercising their sovereignty. And secondly, because they say that our resources are for the development of our people, and they say that we will no longer pay our people starvation wages. Our people must be allowed to thrive, not just survive. I'm going to repeat that. Our people must be allowed to thrive, not just survive. That's the nature of the conflict in the Americas. And I want you to be very clear about it so that you, comrades, can campaign in your own societies to defend the processes against the Monroe Doctrine and to defend your own processes against imperialism. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Vijay. That was a very, very interesting speech. I think I can speak for most of our viewers here that we are overwhelmed and slowly digesting all the information that was presented for us. So let's proceed with the Q&A session that we have now. I believe we have a 5 to 7 questions. I will begin with the first question from Comrade Arul. What happened to the fifth international project once started by Chavez? With many countries now moving in the left in Latin America, is it time to revive this? What happened to the progressive alliance started by Yanis?
Wait,
Yes.
I'm hearing.
Can you hear us?
Now I can hear you. I think that was the Thai channel.
You may turn off your interpretation.
No, mine is on English.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just note for our Thai interpreters, please. Okay. Are we okay to continue?
Yeah, you're sounding great. Continue, please.
All right. So this question comes from Comrade Arul. What happened to the fifth international project once started by Chavez? With many countries now moving in the left in Latin America, is it time to revive this? What happened to the progressive alliance started by Yanis? And can someone put some light into these initiatives? That's a lot of questions. So
it's a good question. Comrade Arul is there. Oh, good. Okay. Well, so comrade, it's nice to read your question. Let me answer it in a reverse order. Firstly, Carlos and I are part of another initiative, which I know that you are well aware of it, and that's the International People's Assembly. The party had come to the meeting in Dhaka, the regional meeting held in Dhaka, when my dear comrade Amit Sengupta was still alive. That must have been about 3.5, 4 years ago. The International People's Assembly is a platform of 200 political and social movements from around the world. Carlos and I are both very much involved in this. In fact, if you go to the Tricontinental website, you will see a plan that Carlos's Institute and Tricontinental put out called A Plan to Save the Planet. And I hope that can be circulated to attendees. I hope it will be translated into Thai, Indonesian, Malay, and Australian. I hope so. Because it's a plan that the International People's Assembly is going to use in the dilemmas of humanity process, to deepen our discussions and conversations about a post-capitalist, in other words, socialist period. So I really recommend you take a look at that. So the International People's Assembly, alive and well, building slowly, building trust among movements across the world around the platform of solidarity. The Progressive International, I'm also on the council of that, but it's a different kind of initiative. It's an initiative of different peoples from different parts of the world, not so much a movement-driven initiative. It's a more people-driven initiative. It has a role. It coordinates actions, produces statements here and there, but it's different. It's not a movement-to-movement platform. It's a person-to-person platform. And Comrade Arul, in this moment, I believe we try everything. We try everything. You throw things against the wall and watch what sticks. And I feel like the International People's Assembly is going to stick because it's a movement to movement process. I mean, the fifth international project is not alien to the International People's Assembly, except we are going slow because we are aware of all the mistakes that were made in the previous international projects, including the Comintern. You can't have a Moscow center anymore. And in fact, it may not have been good to have had a Moscow center beyond, say, 1922. After the United Front statement came out in 1922, 100 years ago, Moscow should have said, look, every continent will now take care of its own line. Unfortunately, Moscow continued to poke its nose. What's happening here? Why are you doing that? We don't recognize you anymore. That's counterproductive. So we have to build an international process that doesn't replicate some of those errors, which honors the program of parties and movements in their own regions or countries. And I think that's what the Assembly is very much seized on building.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Vijay. We can open this question to Comrade Carlos Ron as well, if you would like to answer.
Yes, no, I subscribe what my comrade Vijay spoke about. I think it's important that we have these spaces and to continue to participate in all spaces that will allow our struggles to move on. The Fifth International Movement, it was a proposal that took place among many others. And in certain ways, I think the International People's Assembly, it was sort of a coming together with the spirit that was there at the moment that President Chavez convened or called for a Fifth International. In essence, what was really in the what was really a worry or concern for President Chavez at the time was the dispersion of all progressive left and popular forces, and the need for us to come together for find ways to really move forward and unite, because the more we divide, along different lines, along different small points, the more that imperialism can overcome all of our struggles. So the necessity for unity, regardless what you call it, Fifth International or whatever other organization, is truly coming together and uniting and finding what is that minimum common policy that we can all establish, those minimum points that we all struggle for. We all understand what rights we must defend for people. We know we have to guarantee housing, we have to guarantee healthcare, we have to guarantee education. Those common points that we can all come together. That's the essence of these platforms, and that's, I think, what we should all be looking to struggle for.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Carlos. So we'll proceed to the second question. This question comes from Comrade Aran. What can ASEAN people start doing to replicate their successes in South America? This question is open to both of you.
That's a great question. Look, we are, most of us, I hope, I don't know. I'm a Marxist, and Marxists understand that you can't dream about revolution and make it happen. We dream about revolution every day, okay? But we have to understand the material conditions in which we operate. We have to understand the general level of consciousness of the key classes in our society. We got to understand that after the period of deep, wretched neoliberalism in South America, after the collapse of the dictatorships in the 80s, there was a wretched turn to neoliberalism in much of the continent. I remember visiting Venezuela in the 1990s before Chavez, when Chavez was in jail, actually, after the Caracazo of 92 and then the attempted seizure of power and so on. The country was in desolation. There was a difficulty there. At the same time, there was an incredible sense of a break. There was a sense that we just can't go on like this. And that is where you begin to gauge the strategic opportunity. And I think what was really unique about Chavez is that Chavez combined a very acute strategic understanding of the moment with a mass personality. He had a mass personality. You ever saw that man speak? Speaking individually to one person or speaking to an enormous crowd? He had the personality of a mass leader. You have to have a combination of where the general public, particularly the key classes, say we can't go on like this anymore. That break has to be there. You can't be in a situation where people say we are condemned to, where there's fatalism. See, the three forms of consciousness: fatalism, then reformism, and then chauvinism or jingoism. They are the death of the movement to socialism. When our key classes go in that direction, we have to fight as a movement against chauvinism. We have to guide our movements to test people against reformism and against fatalism. That's the reason that we do our struggles. We give people confidence. We test the level of our movement and so on. We try to move an agenda. I'm not the kind of Marxist that says that the working class is its eyes open and knows always what it's doing. This is not true. That's not true. Bourgeois ideology plays a role. In working class movements, reformism can creep in like this. In working class movements, fatalism can creep in. We'll never be able to win. We can't take on this dictatorship and so on. But yet there is a moment that comes where people say we can't go any longer like this. Where there's a decisive break. And when there's a decisive break, at that point, you either need a very strong vanguard party or you need a mass leader, or both. In Venezuela in the 1990s, there was not a strong vanguard party, if I can be totally frank. There was not. There were a range of different political formations, small ones, some of them. Ex-guerrilla groups that had very strong ideological commitments, including out of which comes Chavez's own brother, from one of these groups. But in Venezuela, you had the advantage of an incredible mass leader who came and brought all the groups together. Actually, he forced them to come together and create an electoral alliance. So if you have a fiercely important mass leader, or you have a vanguard party that understands the mass line, or you have, of course, better if you have both, then you can take advantage of the moment when the key classes say, we can't go on like this. Something has to happen. And comrades, that's what we struggle to build. We struggle to build that conjuncture. Because let me tell you, that conjuncture doesn't build itself. That conjuncture doesn't build itself. Look, you have in Thailand, for instance, okay, you have all the objective conditions. All the objective conditions are there. Good God, I mean, from the 1970s, you've had strikes, in the factories surrounding Bangkok. From the 1970s, you've had a restive working class, you have population in the countryside, restive, levels of distress very high. You have a military come monarchy, that doesn't have an agenda for the people. The objective conditions exist. There's no subjective force available. Either a vanguard party with a significant mass line that's strong enough, to move the agenda, or that kind of mass leader or leaders that are needed. That combination is something we build. There's a line I remember reading from a poet which says that we make the road we must walk on. It's not going to be made for us. We have to struggle hard, deeply. We have to fight against our enemies every day. You have to push aside the dross of bourgeois ideology. You have to fight against propaganda. You have to really be fierce in defending our positions. You can't buckle before them. They're going to come at you with everything. You have to be brave. You have to hold fast with the people. You have to hold fast with our commitments to socialism. Cannot bend before them. You see what I mean? We have to build our own road. And it wasn't easy. You think it was easy in Bolivia? It was a decade of mass struggle. The gas fights, the Cochabamba water and gas wars. Morales himself comes out of rural peasant struggles. It took almost 2 decades to build the vanguard force with the mass line, and then the amazing capacity of the leadership of mass, not just Evo Morales. There's a range of people in mass that are very important. So you asked, can this happen in an ASEAN? Of course it can happen. We are waiting for you. We are waiting for you. And particularly, I must say, in Malaysia, we are waiting for you. We've been waiting for you ever since you had the partition from Singapore. And remember, you almost did it then. You almost did it then. Don't forget your history. It's not true that in our countries, we don't have the capacity for advancing to socialism. All our countries have had movements. They've crushed us, used terrible force, and then they've tried to create amnesia among the people. So they won't remember the glorious struggles in our histories. Can ASEAN countries do it? Of course. Every one of them. Every one of them. We will all follow the example of the peasants of southern Vietnam who rose up despite the fact there were 600,000 US troops in South Vietnam. They rose up and conducted the Tet Offensive. If the peasants of southern Vietnam can do that, all of us can do it anywhere. But we have to build the mass line through our vanguard organizations, and we need to produce our leadership.
Thank you, Mr. Vijay. Mr. Carlos Ron, do you have anything to add? Okay. All right. So another question relating Southeast Asia as well. Let me find that question. Is there a way for independent media outlets in Southeast Asia to confront authoritarianism, imperialism, and capitalism when the only available sources of funding are NED, USAID, and other Western billionaire-backed or government-backed foundations? This question is from an anonymous attendee. So this is open for both of you again.
Carlos, what are your views on National Endowment of Democracy funded news agencies?
Well, we suffered this in Latin America, and we know that this is part of we see now, for example, currently, past part of the way in which the U.S. Foreign policy carries out its aims is precisely through the funding by the National Endowment, by all these U.S. agencies. And it's something they do upright, and they say it openly. It's not even something that brings them any shame. This week there was a hearing in the Senate where openly one of the undersecretaries of the State Department said, where we don't succeed in working with the states, we will go out and find civil society and all these other organizations, and we'll work with them, to and provide them funding. Look, at the end of the day, I think it is difficult for media, independent media, to really find places, because obviously the load of money that these outlets get from U.S. imperialism, in order to set the narrative, in order to set where the conversation should go, is massive. I mean, and it's very hard to compete, and it's very hard to compete even for states. And I'll say this because I lived through this when I was in the United States, in Washington D.C., and I was, it was my job as a diplomat to defend Venezuela. You have newspapers of the scale of the Washington Post that would write every day, every other day, an op-ed or an article, saying things about Venezuela that just weren't true. And at one point we decided, well, we have to answer back. We'll have to reply. And I wrote a letter, on criticizing one of these articles and debunking some of these arguments made. And they published a very small segment of the paper, a small letter. The letter that we did, they took a small part and published it in a corner somewhere. And then when in 2 days after there was another article, I said, okay, I'll do the same thing. I'll reply this time. And then they sent me this letter saying, well, we can't publish this letter because we're going to represent it. We can publish every 6 months. Then they could talk about my country and they could lie about my country, about our realities every day, but I can only reply once every 6 months. That's how close the system is, and that's how difficult it is for us to find outlets. We should do, but we do have now the capability of social media and other instruments that we need, and our networks as well. I mean, if we're all sitting here as part of this socialism conference, well, we should all struggle to read our media, read our own attempts at publishing information. There's so many projects out there, and Vijay could talk about much more about this. But we have LeftWord, for example. We have media like People's Dispatch, for example, that that are doing very independent oriented work that actually to the movement and as a source. And so we must build a network, basically, and support a network ourselves with our militancy, so that we can really inform people what's going on, and we could break that monopoly that that either the big commercial media has, or these U.S. funded outlets have.
Mr. Vijay, do you have anything to add? You're on mute.
Everything Carlos said is correct. Let me just say, but let me also say one more thing in addition, just to repeat actually something Carlos said, which I really, I don't know. I mean, look, Mahira, you and I are not Facebook friends. I don't think so. And I don't know you, and I don't know many of the other people who are here. But so I can't speak to your Facebook accounts, but I am Facebook friends with a lot of my own comrades from my party in India. And I can tell you, a lot of my comrades end up posting from the bourgeois press. Now, they post an article from the bourgeois press and they write a nice acerbic comment. But I keep telling them, comrades, why are you posting their stuff? It raises the algorithm. Post from our newspaper. Post from, as Carlos said, People's Dispatch. Post our own things. Why are you posting always from, The Guardian, that wretched British newspaper? Why are you posting from there? Post our own things. We don't do it. We don't. Maybe we don't respect ourselves, comrades. Maybe we don't respect ourselves. You want to learn about Cuba? Go online, read Grandma. What's wrong with Grandma? It's a terrific newspaper. Read Grandma. Read what our comrades are saying. You want to know about Venezuela? Go read Venezuela analysis. Read People's Dispatch. It's one of the best. Bloody come and watch our show every Friday, okay? It's called Give the People What They Want. What are you guys doing? I can't believe it. You want access to world news? Watch Prashant, Zoe, and myself every Friday. We are there for you. But you won't watch it and you won't share it with your friends and so on. So then we don't respect ourselves. See, if comrades don't share our own work, if I'm not sharing from your party paper and what you guys are saying and so on, then I'm not taking you seriously. I'm taking some bourgeois newspaper from, Malaysia seriously. Okay, that's wrong. By the way, I get most of my news from Malaysia, as it turns out, by reading my friend Jomo Sundaram's weekly column that I get in his email. And that's not even always on Malaysia. Jomo mainly writes about international affairs, but I find those emailed columns very useful. But I should share those more often, send it to other friends and so on. You see what I'm saying? What Carlos pointed out is very important. I'm not telling you don't read the bourgeois press. The first thing I read in the morning is the Financial Times. Okay? And I have to say, I actually agree with a lot of things they write there because, unlike the New York Times and the Washington Post, the financial newspapers can't afford to fully lie. They can't afford to lie completely. And the reason they can't lie completely is there's money at stake. You see, their fellows have to make money. So they have to actually give you some sense of accurate reporting. So I end up reading the Financial Times, but I also read People's Dispatch every day. And I must say, we have to have a new ethic. We can only build the so called independent media if we take it seriously.
Okay. All right. Attendees, we are getting school right now. Please take a look at the chat. Take a look at the chat section where our friend Kangsha has shared the Give People What They Want Spotify link, please, as per Mr. Vijay. Okay, so right now we have a long list of questions, but I will touch more regarding closely more towards Latin American. So there's one question from an anonymous attendee. How do you interpret Pedro Castillo's condemnation of the Nicaraguan election results? So please, Vijay or Carlos?
Remember what I said, what Pedro Castillo faced ever since he came into office. He faced an enormous amount of pressure. And I think we have to understand some of these statements as part of the kind of release of the pressure. That agenda, that right-wing communication agenda, it has its impact on people's minds. In Chile, for instance, the center-left candidate, Gabriel Boric, makes it a habit of attacking Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and so on. Now, I still want Gabriel Boric to defeat Mr. Cast in Chile. Mr. Cast is a fascist, okay? He's an outright fascist. Gabriel Boric is infected by this idea that, you have to be so-called reasonable, which means you concede to some of the imperialist dogmas. And I think that's how I see it, is that these are concessions. I mean, in among the center left in Latin America, this includes Michelle Bachelet of Chile. There's a center left component that is uncomfortable with the revolutionary processes. Again, let's be honest, when we talk about the pink tide, that pink tide was not unanimous. It was not all believing the same things. There were center left governments in the pink tide, but they were not revolutionary governments. They were not actually driving a revolutionary agenda. Only a handful of the countries in Latin America in that entire period, you know, of course, Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, these countries were trying to drive a kind of left agenda. Mexico is not AMLO, the current president of Mexico, is governing from the left, but he's not driving, he doesn't have the capacity to drive a revolutionary agenda in Mexico where they're changing the productive forces. You see, in Venezuela, Carlos mentioned already, there's this entire project of the comunas, of these incredible missions to build housing, where the poor just said, this is our land, and the government gave some resources, cement and various other kind of building materials, and the poor built their own housing. That's a revolutionary process. The comunas, the building of cooperatives, cooperative agricultural production, that's a revolutionary process. That is not happening in all the countries. So center left, you can govern a bourgeois state from the left, or you can attempt to deepen a revolutionary process. And I would say that's the difference within the pink tide. Like, for instance, when President Lula was the president of Brazil, he governed Brazil from the left, but he didn't drive a complete revolutionary agenda, but he did some amazing things. They basically abolished hunger. They created public education, which increased the number of people, particularly deprived populations, Afro-Brazilians and so on, to enter public colleges. That was an incredible advance. I can tell you, if President Lula wins again in 2022, he is not going to merely govern from the left. I'm telling you, he is going to open up a revolutionary path in Brazil, and this is going to be a real class struggle, because Brazil has a sophisticated and entrenched ruling class, which is not going to tolerate it easily. Not going to tolerate. But Lula is a far more committed revolutionary now than he was even in 2004. Far more. So I just want to make that distinction between governing a bourgeois state from the left and driving a revolutionary agenda. I would say that when Hugo Chavez won the election in 1998, began to govern in 1999, he governed Venezuela from the left. And it's in the process of the elections and the new constitution and so on that you see a deepening happening in Venezuela. And then through a kind of dialectical process, Chavez's government, rather than governing Venezuela from the left, opened up a revolutionary process that was actually outside the state. That's the other thing. A lot of the revolutionary process happened outside the state, encouraging cooperative production and so on. And a lot of it assisted by the state, the healthcare, the literacy program, for instance. We don't often talk about Venezuela's literacy program, where illiteracy was essentially taken care of. How? Because they adopted the Cuban literacy model designed in 1961. It's a brilliant model. So for all those reasons, I'm saying we have to be very careful, when we observe a government. Are they governing from the left, or are they trying to drive a revolutionary process?
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Vijay. So there are a lot more questions, but there are some that touches on issues in China. So since we are running out of time, we may just skip these questions and go straight to one last question. Could you discuss the significance of the victory of Xiomara Castro in Honduras for the Central American left?
Carlos, please.
That's the last question
Well,
I can provide now.
I think that is a very important victory in the sense that what happened in Honduras in 2009 was the overthrow of a democratically elected government of President Mel Zelaya, and I think Honduras underwent from there on a very uh, terrible period of instability and of undemocratic governance. So that finally the forces, the political forces, were able to overcome fraud and all the other limitations placed on democracy there to regain space. So I think the progressive forces in Latin America and all around the world should really look forward to this victory, which was not going to be an easy path for, I'm sure, for President-elect Castro. She'll have, of course, a lot of the challenges that we all progressive governments have faced in Latin America. But there's certainly, commitment to a transformation of Honduras that is coming, and that would now be visible in the next coming weeks. Again, I think it is a it's a way to undo that terrible coup that affected Honduras many years ago in 2009, and that sort of derailed Honduras from a process of integrating into a more democratic and more popular government. The basic issue that the opposition, the conservative forces had with the government of Mel Zelaya was that he was working towards a constituent assembly, and a place where you could actually deepen a popular project in Honduras, and he was approaching this in a democratic way. So we see, that now, and I don't know if this is something that is going to happen, but it is important that these popular forces are coming back to try to make Honduras a more popular and a more democratic society, and not be so much kidnapped by the forces that have been ruling Honduras with repression and with tremendous ties to drug trafficking that we have seen. The brother, I don't know if you know, but the brother of the current president of Honduras is actually was taken to prison in the United States for drug trafficking, and all these ties that are presumed to exist that should be addressed. So hopefully now it is a chance, an opportunity for Honduras to have to regain the path towards to strengthening their democracy and really tending to people's necessities.
Thank you, Comrade Carlos. Comrade Vijay, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, Carlos put it very well.
Great. All right. So as per the organizing committee, we are requesting for an extension of 20 minutes, if that is okay, as we have a lot of questions that
Why not? Why not?
Thank you so much. So there is a few demands of me picking a question relating to China. And this question comes from Chris Lee. Is China becoming an imperialist country as shown by its bullying attitude towards smaller neighboring countries over Southeast Asia? Comrade Vijay?
Well, what an inevitable question. Thank you very much, my dear comrades from Southeast Asia, for dragging me into this particular debate, which I was hoping we were probably not going to get into. And this question is interesting because it comes with its own answer in it. Word bullying is there, smaller is there, and so on. So the question is a trap, and therefore I don't want to entertain it. But I want to come at the question from a different angle. I know that the general orientation is China imperialist, correct? That's the general orientation. Um, and I actually don't think it's an imperialist country if you look at those five controls, which is a good definition of imperialism. China is a very big country. So is India. These are very big countries which um, are basically trying to exercise their sovereignty in a very complicated way. And we have to be wary of that, as other countries in Asia have to be wary of what's happening. Burma, for instance, is between India and China. It has, we don't want countries to fall into the trap of getting caught up in rivalries and so on. And that applies to the small countries. I don't know which ones you're referring to, but that exist on the edge of China. I mean, there are opportunities, and then there are obviously worries, because you're a smaller country, it's a big country. Now, it doesn't matter whether the government is a communist government or the government is a capitalist government or whatever. The question is also of scale. It's a matter of scale, that applies. You've got small country bordering a large country. The large country has immense resources. Smaller country doesn't have resources. That's the first thing. It has nothing to do with the character of the larger country, what its economic system is and so on. I don't know any example anywhere in the world where a smaller country has felt confident on the edge of a larger country. Okay, I just don't know how you can imagine that a smaller country doesn't feel threatened in some way. That's just the nature of the thing. Look at India and Nepal. India routinely shuts the Nepali border. Isolates Nepal when there's any conflict. There's a conflict now over an area called Kalapani, which is within India and Nepal's bordering region. And when there's a conflict, India shuts the border. When India shuts the border, Nepal has no access to anything, because the other side of the border is the Himalayas. It has very hard time getting to China. There is, of course, in Mustang a road to China, and that's an interesting area because it's got an uranium development. And I could get into the story of how the left government in Nepal was pulled down by the United States, because the Oli section of that communist government basically wanted to make a deal with the US. So talk about bullying. The Nepali people gave a mandate to the left to govern, and the government was brought down. So, when we use the word bullying, we should also have some measure of understanding that this has to do with scale and history. Okay, that's over there. My feeling is that until recently, the Chinese government was oscillating between a kind of national interest, kind of patriotism, let's call it that, and developing the productive forces. This really has changed in the period since Xi Jinping came to power. And what's the nature of that change? The Chinese Communist Party, 90 million members, by the way, 90 million members, larger than most of the Southeast Asian countries. That's just the that's the Communist Party of China. 90 million members is enormous. India, the party I belong to in India, we have 1 million members. That's a pretty big party, I must tell you also, but nothing compared to 90 million. Inside the Communist Party in China, there's been an enormous debate over the last 20 years over what was happening since the 1978 reforms. The direction taken by Hu Jintao, direction taken by the party in general. It was going in a way of giving the individual capitalists much too much power. Xi Jinping comes from the left side of the party, and this was an attempt to drive a left agenda, and it's had many aspects. One of which was the abolition of poverty inside the country. The second was to increase China's role in the world, and that's happened in two different ways. One way it's happened is that China is using its immense surpluses to build its own market capacity outside the West. China has understood that it was actually what the IMF called, it was in a satanic embrace with the United States, where China was essentially producing lots of goods, then lending money to the US consumer to buy the Chinese goods. It was a bizarre cycle of a recycling mechanism. So the Chinese have figured out, look, we can't rely on Western markets. So we've got to build markets elsewhere. A lot of the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of these deals like the train to Laos and so on, it's not just about development, it's also building markets and integrating economies in a different way. So what I feel is that I don't think China is being imperialist. I think that it's in fact developing infrastructure in different parts of the world. It has its own national interests in mind. Now the issue is, what are our objectives in our countries? If I'm sitting in Zambia, now for the first time in 50 years, I have a choice between taking an IMF loan and taking a Belt and Road loan. The question isn't the loan that I'm taking. The question is, what's my project? You see, you can't just sit back and say, oh, I'm being taken advantage of by the West or taken advantage of by China. We haven't settled accounts with our own class leadership in our countries. You see, if you're sitting in Malaysia, what is your agenda? What is your government's agenda? What is its project for the Malaysian people? And based on that project, you'll figure out how do we integrate with the Chinese Belt and Road. Recently there's been a fake scandal about Uganda's airport. Uganda signed a deal for 207 million US dollars to help develop its Entebbe International Airport. In October, there was a parliamentary discussion in one of the parliamentary regulatory bodies. The finance minister was sitting there. He was questioned about the agreement that the government had signed 7 years ago with the Chinese Export Import Bank for $207 million to be paid off, and then a 7-year grace period. He said there in that meeting that there are 13 clauses in the agreement. Now, on reflection, we don't think they are good clauses. I apologize for signing them. Okay, nobody forced him to sign them. He didn't have to sign it. He did say in that meeting, we took the deal without really studying the text because it was a really good deal for us financially. No one else was going to lend us this money to retrofit the only international airport we have in Uganda. Just a few weeks later, the Daily Monitor in Kampala ran a very mischievous story, headline, something like, China seizes Uganda's airport. Okay. Immediately, the government said there's no such thing. We're in a 7-year grace period. The government of Uganda is back the loan. We're going to pay it back. Bloomberg immediately ran the story, said China seizes Entebbe airport. Then the Chinese embassy in Kampala released a note saying, this is not what's happening. Look at the facts. We have made a commercial agreement here. We have not seized anything. Then there were lots of stories suddenly on Twitter saying, and China seized this, all of them are fake stories. See, my issue here is not to say, oh, China is the greatest country in the world and whatever. My issue is here, what are our countries doing? The Ugandan finance minister sits there and says, I'm sorry, I didn't read the agreement properly. What kind of finance minister have we elected? What kind of governments do we have? See, the Chinese are sitting there negotiating with you on a pretty fair basis. What are you asking for? You can't just say, oh, the Chinese. You see, it's different from the IMF. Because the IMF comes to our countries and says, I put money on the table, but then you have to change all these things. Stop financing your health, stop financing. Chinese don't say that. They come and say, we'll give you a loan to fix your airport. Now, this is the terms of the loan. Why couldn't the Ugandans say we don't accept these terms? And by the way, other countries have negotiated and said, we don't like these terms. You understand what I'm getting at? We've got to be careful not to believe the kind of communication warfare that happens. China steals the airport. Where did that come from? That's basically part of the hybrid war. On the other hand, we don't have to go overboard and say China is the greatest country in the world. What we need to be critical of is our own class reality. Our own governments are unable to properly defend the rights of their people because these are commercial agreements. Any country, a socialist country as well, except Cuba, because Cuba is the Jedi Knights of socialism, okay? They are at another level. I mean, the Cuban doctors go abroad, they don't ask for anything. But any socialist project, okay, has to balance the national interest with socialist internationalism. They have to balance the two. And I think in China, there is a serious struggle over that. I'm going to give you one more point about this. I was in Morocco about 5 years ago taking a train. I was writing a story about the human rights situation in Western Sahara. I was taking a train to southern Morocco. On the train, I saw 6 Chinese people sitting there. Now, I'm a curious person. I went up and said, "Hi, what are you doing in Morocco? You 6 Chinese people." Okay, it's an offensive thing. I agree. But I'm a journalist. That's what people like me do. And I got a really interesting story. There was a woman there. She must have been in her early 50s. And she said, "I'm a doctor." And she said, "We are all doctors and we come from," and then she named a province. She said, "In China, every province sends doctors abroad to go and assist people in certain projects." She said, "I am here on a 7-year mission to do women's health." Now, we don't hear anything about it. The Chinese government does a terrible job in propaganda. You see, what did Fidel Castro do? Fidel Castro brought all the Cuban doctors into a room. He said there was a hero that came from the United States and fought on our side against the Spanish. His name was Henry Reeve. So we are going to call all of you doctors the Henry Reeve Brigade, and you're going to go out there and do these things. Now, why doesn't Xi Jinping say, "I'm going to call all these doctors into an auditorium in Beijing," and it'll have to be a big auditorium because in China, even a small meeting has like 10,000 people. They all gather in there. And Xi Jinping says, during the Revolutionary War in China, fighting alongside Mao Zedong was a Canadian doctor by the name of Norman Bethune. He, in fact, died during the fight of the Chinese people against imperialism. And so we are going to name all of you as being part of the Norman Bethune Brigade. Then you and I will hear about Chinese doctors in Morocco, Chinese doctors in Pakistan, Chinese doctors in Malawi. Do you understand? I later went and found this Chinese doctors studying dysentery in several African countries, not just studying, but healing people. We don't know about all this. See, all we hear is what the Western media tells us. Oh, they're stealing the port in Hambantota in Sri Lanka. Not true. Not me. The Atlantic magazine in the United States ran a long story saying that the claim that the Chinese are stealing the port, the Sri Lankan port in Hambantota, is totally false. There is no debt trap diplomacy. But see how that phrase comes, debt trap diplomacy. So I want to caution us. I want us to have a balanced attitude to these things. It's very easy to get swept up in this anti-China thing. And as socialists, we have to be careful because there's this anti-China thing has two axes to it. On the one side, there is an old yellow peril racism. The Chinese are coming, be careful of them. Okay, there's that. And secondly, comrades, there is a deep antipathy to communism involved in this. Be careful, they are authoritarian, etc. Our entire political project is wrapped up in this anti-China thing. Now, that doesn't mean I'm saying to you, look, if you're Vietnam, just don't worry, the Chinese. No, there are going to be problems and pressures. In 1978, Vietnam and China fought a war, okay? The Chinese and Vietnamese fought a border war. They have a long-standing set of disagreements. At the same time, they are collaborating a lot. During the pandemic, they collaborated a lot, okay? When the ASEAN summit, I think, took place in Vietnam, Vietnam refused to allow anti-China rhetoric because they see the Chinese as fraternal. They understand the anti-communism of this attack on China. They understand the racism of this attack on China. Yes, they have issues about this island, that island, and so on. But I'm actually asking for balance and caution, a lot of abundance of caution. I know that people get swept up in the propaganda around Xinjiang. I'm just going to warn you that I've seen the way the sausage of the hybrid war operates. I've seen it front and center. I've talked to many CIA agents and heard this from them. Be careful what you believe. When you get swept up into this rage about Xinjiang or Taiwan or whatever it is, just be careful. Abundance of caution, comrades, abundance of caution.
Thank you, Comrade Vijay. I believe all what you have answered has already been applied to some of the questions we have right now. So maybe as a closing question, the final question, since you are a member of the governing party in Kerala, there's a question related to how you see the socialism development in Kerala itself.
Well, look, Venezuela is a sovereign country whose sovereignty is being squashed by imperialism. Um, Cuba is a sovereign country. Its sovereignty is being squashed by imperialism. Kerala is a state in the Indian Union. So it has only a limited ability what you can do in a state in the Indian Union. Nonetheless, the Left Democratic Front government has made some incredible gains. A socialist government must first pledge to do very basic things. We have to first make sure people are not hungry. We have to make sure illiteracy is completely abolished. We have to create a health system. These are the first tasks, but that's not enough. The government in Kerala is not a government that won an election and sits from above. You see, in Kerala, our movement actually has put public action as a very high priority. So I'll give you an example. When the pandemic was first identified by our health minister at the time, K.K. Shailja teacher, because we had students from Kerala in Wuhan, in Hubei province in China, where the outbreak was first detected in late December, January 2020. At that time, the health minister said there is this pandemic. We have to, not pandemic then, there is a health emergency. We have to be very careful what's happening. Immediately, the trade unions, for instance, because we were told by the WHO, you got to wash hands, and remember all that, wash hands, and how in Vietnam they made that lovely song. Remember that lovely song? You watched the video of the kids anyway. In Kerala, the trade unions went to bus stations. They didn't wait for the government to do anything. They created sinks so that when people got off buses, they could wash their hands. One of the largest all women's cooperatives in the world is Kudumbushri. It's a parastatal cooperative. Millions of Indian women inside this, women from Kerala in Kudumbushri. Kudumbushri normally makes packaged pickles and makes honey and tea and so on. They stopped all that and they started producing masks and hand sanitizer. This is public action. You see, public action is a very important part of socialism. Socialism isn't only about getting the state institutions to function for the public good. You have to inculcate public action. Why? Because part of the project in Kerala is as much as possible to create a participatory democracy. When we were in power in the 1990s, we engaged the public in what was called participatory planning. We have a couple of books at LeftWord Books about this, written by the former finance minister, T.M. Thomas Isaac, about participatory planning. It's a really important story about how every district had to enter the planning process and write their own plan and send it up to the regional area. And then eventually the state of Kerala, population 35 million, produced a plan that was produced from the smallest hamlet all the way up to the capital city. It's an incredible thing. But that engendered a sense in the population that they can be involved in governance. So this inculcating public action is a key part of the movement in Kerala. Our great limitation, comrades, and I'm telling you this very honestly, is in Kerala, the state relies on remittance payments coming from the Gulf. That's an enormous part of the income of people. And the government was able to make advances through redistributing the surplus. The challenge now in Kerala, as in other socialist projects, is how to grow the pie. You can't just build socialism by redistributing the pie. And that is why we look to see what the Chinese have done, you see, because they have been able to grow the pie. And how did they do that? Because, you see, they abolished absolute poverty. Nobody denies that. In India, all of India, we think about 100, 200, 300, 400, 500. We don't even know how many million people are in absolute poverty. At least 150 million people in absolute poverty. Okay, most likely more. We think that about 300-400 million people have a hard time eating every day. Okay, that's the government statistics. Given that, the idea of not growing the economy is a serious one. Is there enough wealth in the society to merely redistribute? There's a lot of wealth you can redistribute. It must be done. But you have to also think of, are there different ways to produce the things that we need? Are there different ways to engender aspirations, to meet people's aspirations and so on? These are big challenges for actually existing socialist projects. And it's not just Kerala. Again, it's just a state in the Indian Union, but 35 million people. Okay, it's not a small place. Venezuela also has the same struggles. You can build communas, you grow your own agriculture and so on, but at some point you'll have to face the problem of industrialization. What do we produce? And then you'll have to face the problem of the high tech industry. Do we have to train more people to understand the digital world and so on? How do we grow the economy? What kind of technology will we require? And these are real pressing questions. I know that occasionally people dismiss all this stuff and say, oh, this is dengism. There's a term of art, is dengism. You want to build the productive forces. Well, how the hell are you going to expect our societies to have 100% electrification if we don't build an electricity grid? To build an electricity grid, you need some industry, for God's sake. So in our poorer countries where you're building socialism, you can't build socialism merely by redistribution. You have to grow the country, and that's a challenge. You have to make all kinds of ugly compromises. That's a challenge. But we are realistic about our socialism. We are realistic.
All right. Thank you, Comrade. So we are running out of time. So I would love to just get your closing statements and any takeaways that you can give us for both Comrade Vijay and Comrade Carlos.
Well, first, again, I want just to stress our thanks for allowing us to participate, for inviting us. I think it's important, again, that we come to spaces like this where we can share our experiences with each other, when we can, learn more about our common struggles. It is very important because the attacks and the aggressions are huge, and they would only increase in the way that we succeed in our projects. So it is important to know, to have knowledge about each other, and to share these experiences so we can build together our movement, and build together socialism in the ways that we can each contribute. I want to again also express, and from our stance in the Venezuelan revolution, the Venezuelan revolutionary project, that we are in solidarity with all the struggles for socialism throughout the world. We have a very difficult time ahead of us, with a climate crisis, and with a crisis of the capitalist model that will affect us all equally. And is precisely at this conjuncture, where with so many difficulties ahead of us, that we must stick together and show that solidarity is, solidarity, cooperation are the true values of socialism, are the true values that we can uphold, and that will help us overcome all these challenges ahead. Thank you again for this opportunity, and of course, a pleasure to be with you in this conference, and of course, seeing my brother Vijay, and it's also makes it even much better to be here. Thank you.
Well, I will be seeing Carlos very soon, and we're going to have our own democracy summit. It's going to be the real democracy summit, Joe. So if you are interested, Mr. Biden, you can tune in to Caracas and watch the democracy summit with democratic people like Evo Morales and Nicolas Maduro and others, because we practice participatory democracy and not this fake capitalist democracy that you are, flogging to the planet, bullying people to come to your democracy summit. 150 countries have said yes. Listen, friends, go and look at the last vote on behalf of Cuba in the UN General Assembly. 184 countries voted to end the US embargo. Many of those countries are going to go for the democracy summit because the boss has called them. When the mafia boss calls you, you go. Okay? That's what the democracy summit is. Mafia boss has called, you know, Don Joe has called them, they gone running. We are going to have our own democracy summit in Caracas. It's a summit of the people. Okay, so be aware of that. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Socialist Party Malaysia. Wow, so great. Guys, I'm telling you, I'm waiting. I've got my stopwatch on. When are you going to start your deepened socialist project in Malaysia? Invite me, I'll come. We'll walk the streets of Kuala Lumpur and see you building the monument to socialism on every step. I'd like to see people walking in pride. You know what you see in a socialist country? You don't see people looking down and walking, hunched shoulders, People walk with pride. You go to Cuba, I told you, they are like Jedi Knights. The Cuban people, they don't hunch their shoulders before anybody. Go to Venezuela, they are pretty. Venezuela is a Caribbean country. They were bold anyway. I don't think Venezuelans know how to hunch their shoulders. They were not colonized like us in Asia, where the British would say, "Look down," don't look up. And then in India, even worse, long history of caste. You couldn't look in the eyes of the Brahmins and so on. Hideous stuff. So better get to work out there in Malaysia, in Thailand, Indonesia. We are waiting for you. In Philippines, we are waiting for you. Duterte, what will you do with that fellow? And Australia, Scott Morrison, is he a real person? I'm not sure. Just betrayed the French in order to go and suck up to the Americans and the British. Is he a real person, Scott Morrison? Fiction of the Australian imagination? Come on, guys, get to work, okay? We're waiting for you. Carlos and I want to come on a tour of, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, but get to work. We're counting on you, okay? We can't do it over there. We want you to do it, and then we'll come and see. Then in Caracas, we can have a symposium, okay? We'll call the symposium the Future of the Socialist Experiments in Southeast Asia and their fight against imperialist threat. Can we do that? In 1 year, 2 years, how many years? Thanks a lot.
Oh my, we got school well, didn't we? This actually made my week, all right. From learning of the 5 areas of imperialism controls, finding the inner fierce, brave mass leader, and organizing of the vanguard party with a significant mass line to move the agenda, and not getting caught in the hybrid war propaganda. And may from this keynote speech, we will feel more inspired, motivated, more disciplined to make greater efforts in becoming more well-informed socialists and support our own non-mainstream news platform so that we can overcome the media and communications trap, just what Comrade Vijay states. So echoing back to what Comrade Prashad said, our people must be allowed to thrive, not just survive. Southeast Asian comrades, Latin America is waiting for us. And with that, comrades, we have reached the end of the session.
What a great summary. Congratulations.
Thank you. As a moderator, I would like to give my biggest thanks to both our comrades, Carlos and Vijay, for making this session a success. And knowing that they have stayed up early in the morning hours just to be with us and to share their knowledge with us when they could have been sleeping, since it is the weekend. And of course, I would also love to thank our fellow comrades for their interpretation services throughout this session.